So thank you very much for attending this sixth webinar of the series Debating Development. I am Réginas. I am a teaching assistant and PhD student at the Institute of Development Policy, IOB for short. And I will be acting tonight as the moderator. The Debating Development series is a collaboration between the Institute of Development Policy, IOB, and the University Foundation for Development Cooperation, Abiosseh. The Debating Development series is in addition both a course and a public event. Students have submitted their questions in advance, and I'm sure that they are passed on to Philipp and Abiosseh, our speakers. Today's topic is about a decolonial critique of state-building interventions. And by state-building interventions, we understand programmatic interventions which are implemented by advanced countries or international organizations in some fragile states in order to equip them with institutions that address their governance challenges. But this encounter also comes with some challenges because it occurs in a context of unequal power relations. So to address this topic tonight, we try to find two amazing and complementary speakers, one with an academic background and another one who analyzed the issue from a more practitioner perspective. That's of course a simplification because they have other identities which for sure influence the way in which they approach the subject under debate. In terms of time management, Philipp's keynote speech will take half an hour. Thereafter, Abiosseh will react to Philipp's key arguments and possibly from her experience as practitioner, open up new perspectives for reflection. After Abiosseh's address, based on the many insightful questions received from our students, we will have a Q&A session. You are also invited to use Pour Everywhere, and the link will shortly appear in the chat. And you can ask your questions or vote for the question that you consider more relevant to our keynote speaker and the discussant. For those who are on Twitter, you can use the dev when referring to debating development. You will see also the link in the chat. So before I close these introductory remarks, let me introduce our two debating keynote speaker and discussant. But for this time, I think we will break with tradition and start with the discussion, Abiosseh Davis, and this for two reasons. First, because Abiosseh comes from afar, she's based in Nairobi, and second, because Philipp is a true gentleman. So, first of all, I am going to introduce Abiosseh. She's the Global Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Manager at Interpeace. She has over 10 years of experience providing technical and management support for the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of peace building, democracy, and governance initiatives. Prior to joining Interpeace, Abiosseh served as a monitoring and evaluation specialist at Counterpart International, where she provided support for monitoring progress and evaluating impact for projects implemented in over 22 countries. A passion for inclusive development, quality interventions, and learning for improvement have shaped Abiosseh's career. She enjoys leading processes for strategic thinking and analysis to develop contextually appropriate strategies to advance peace and development. Beyond design, monitoring, and evaluation, Abiosseh has specialized expertise in organizational development, training design, and delivery facilitation, and gender and youth integration. She also has a keen interest in change management and how to bring private sector learning into development and peace-building initiatives. Abiosseh has extensive experience managing research and evaluation processes. She's an avid gender advocate and strives to ensure that the perspectives, needs, and interests of men, women, girls, and boys are recognized in her work. Abiosseh holds a Master's of Arts in Gender and Development from the Institute of Development Studies in Brighton, in the UK. She received a bachelor's degree of science in international politics with a focus on trans-state actors from the School of Foreign Services at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Our keynote speaker is David Lottholz. He's affiliated at the Collaborative Research Center and the Dynamics of Security and the Institute for Sociology, Justus Liebig University, Gießen in Germany. Philipp's research focuses on political and social change in post-socialist Central Asia and Eastern Europe, and in particular evolving trajectories of state building, peace building, and security practices. Outputs from his PhD research on community security, inter-ethnic reconciliation, and politics of difference have been published in International Peacekeeping, Journal of Intervention and State Building, Central Asian Survey, and in the edited collections Interrogating Illiberal Peace in Eurasia, Critical Perspective on Peace and Conflicts, and Hybridity. This perspective is further extrapolated into debates on post-decolonial thought in a special issue titled Decolonial Theory and Practices in Southeast Europe. It's a book co-edited with Polina Malonova and Katarina Kuzik for Diversia. So now I'm going to give the floor to Philipp. Philipp, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Réginas, and also to all of your colleagues for the kind invitation. It's a real pleasure for me to be invited tonight to speak about this topic on which I did my PhD and which I further extended, but I always enjoy returning back to these initial beginnings of my research. And I will start right away by sharing my PowerPoint presentation. So as Réginas already mentioned, the topic is decolonial critique of state building interventions. And yeah, I want to go right in because he kindly already introduced my institutional and disciplinary background. And yeah, I would just add that I did my PhD research on community security and peacebuilding initiatives in southern Kyrgyzstan, and I'm currently extending my research, as Réginas already mentioned, to comparisons with peace and security practices in Eastern Europe, but also in Europe more generally and across the world. So because I don't have that much time, and we will spend more time in the discussion where we can then go deeper into certain aspects, I'm structuring this keynote into 3 parts. So for the beginning, I want to conceptualize decoloniality and decolonization, and yeah, somehow establish what we understand under that, or what different people might understand under these terms, to then move on to this decolonial critique of state building interventions, which, as you will see, is not a very easy matter. And after having considered that, I want to go into some more practical aspects or ways forward from a dilemma that I will basically present you in this decolonial critique. So to basically think about whether, and if yes, how we can decolonize state building practice, or maybe more exactly security and social ordering practices. But I will come to that later. And in terms of conceptualizing decoloniality and decolonization, I have the pleasure, but also the opportunism to build up on the previous events in this series, because of course I can impossibly explore the entire depth and breadth of decolonial thought here. So I will stay superficial and brief to be able to move on. And I think the most important thing that I share with many other people is considering coloniality really a main issue basically in the current world, and an issue that both academics but also people working in policy and practice need to grapple with. Relations, institutions, societies are still very much characterized by coloniality, and we need to grapple with that. So Aníbal Quijano has offered a useful definition already back in 2000, which I think is a good starting point. So he argued that the modern world system began to form with the colonization of America, and it has in common three central elements that affect quotidian life of the totality of the global population, meaning this coloniality of this world system affects even our everyday lives today. And these are the coloniality of power, capitalism, and Eurocentrism. And he further argues that the globality of this system basically means that it's a basic level of common social practices, and it's a common orientation for the entire world today. And of course, this is based on lengthy discussions of the long 16th century, of various processes of colonization, of imperial dominance, and even of political decolonization. But we still come to these conclusions today. So basically, coloniality is just another side of the coin of modernity. Modernity being the form, the modality of social organization that the world is currently predominantly living in. As Walter Mignolo argued, coloniality is constitutive of modernity. There is no modernity without coloniality, meaning the world that we live in today, it's built upon colonial exploitation and domination, and we really need to rethink and rebuild this world in order to maybe somehow get rid of these colonial relations. So Mignolo calls this a colonial matrix of power that is characterizing our current world, and Quijano talks about the coloniality of power. So these terms are to an extent interchangeable. And there's a much more work that we should bear in mind and that can be helpful in different aspects, or that should maybe be even more central. For example, on geo and body politics that operate through race, gender, and sexuality. So this idea that everything that we are, that somehow defines our existence, that is also determined and structured through coloniality. And why? This is because even knowledge, subjectivity, and being, so let's say central characteristics of our existence, the way we think, even they are basically subject to coloniality and these processes of colonial domination. So that means that if we want to somehow work towards a decolonial critique of state building, or of anything else for that matter, this critique would have to exhibit, deconstruct, but also find ways to dismantle the coloniality of power, or the colonial matrix of power that structures states, but basically the current modern system in general. And that is a very difficult endeavor, which I want to substantiate now, because the question is then, what does decolonization actually mean? That has been a bit of a controversy in recent years, and yeah, it's really something that is worth reflecting about briefly. So as I already mentioned, we have processes of a political or formal decolonization that lead to this form of independence of countries from their former colonial dominating powers. But of course, the issue with that is, if we look at the current post-colonial world, so formerly colonized countries, the question is really, how much is this formal independence worth, and can we even talk about independence, or is it simply a continuity of colonial dominance? So as many would argue, this political decolonization simply doesn't work, or it's not really worth anything. Then from this kind of, yeah, let's say frustration or dissatisfaction with political decolonization, we have a whole canon or genealogy of such as dependency theory, world systems theory, and post-development theory, which I would argue, yeah, predispose this path towards decolonial thought. Maybe Arturo Escobar being one of the prime thinkers who made that move from post-development theory to decolonial thought. And so it's clear that decolonization, it should be something more fundamental, and that decolonial thought is important when we think about state building interventions or social processes in general. Now, Yves Tuck and Wayne Young, they have made an important point saying that decolonization is not a metaphor. Because what happened, obviously, in recent years is that decolonization became a thing that pretty much everyone wanted to somehow do in their respective areas. So whether it is education, for example, or whether we are talking, let's say, about community level processes, decolonizing things is pretty reasonable given the emancipatory and really positive ideas underlying decolonial thought. But there's also a bit of an issue with this, what's called mainstreaming of decoloniality. And that is that thinking back about the origins of decolonial thought, decolonization is really about the repatriation of indigenous land and life, as Yves Tuck and Wayne Young argue. And they make it very clear that decolonization is not a metaphor for other things that we want to do to improve our societies, as I mentioned, education, or maybe even sports or whatnot. Of course, this is their argument that it should not be that way, and we know that it's not exactly that way, and that decolonization and decolonizing things is a very widespread agenda and ambition. So we have this slight problem or conundrum that basically we have a substantive understanding of decolonization, which is really about reversing and dismantling the outcomes of settler colonialism, of the dispossession of indigenous land and life, versus a more metaphorical understanding of decolonization, which is not really about indigenous struggles versus settler colonialism, but maybe more about a more just society or more access to education, which are also very important points, but they are not the same. And I'm not necessarily arguing that we should only pursue the one application of decolonization versus the other, but that, let's say, if we move into other discussions, other sectors, such as state building interventions, we need to bear in mind that decolonization is originally about this more substantive issue of settler colonialism. Moving on, I just wanted to briefly also indicate different, let's say, fields of research and debate and practice beyond this problematic, this original problematic of settler colonialism. And these are quite straightforward and something that I think many of us have to grapple with, even if not all. So one problem that people that are based in the North or in the West in industrialized countries, at universities or in other knowledge institutions, one problem that they might arguably face is sort of first world remoteness, a remoteness from these indigenous struggles. Doesn't concern everyone, and we are all aware that almost every Western state basically has issues with settler colonialism that should be decolonized, but it's still an issue that academia and many societal sectors are very remote from these original problems. And then there might also be other problems such as white saviorism, which was discussed earlier in the series, and basically this issue that the first world or industrial Western country should rather turn to an internal critique rather than trying to kind of help with indigenous struggles for decolonization. A second problem, which is really something that I would like to carry into this debate here today, but I hope I can also inspire some people to think about that further, is with the so-called second world. So we often use the term third world or maybe global south or other terms, which basically designate this focus of both development studies but also state building intervention on many countries in Africa and Asia and so on. But usually what is not looked at is the former second world, meaning Eastern Europe, wider Eurasia, Central Asia, briefly basically the former Soviet bloc and other post-socialist countries in Eurasia. And so the question really is, where are they in decolonial debates, but maybe also where are they in development studies? And why are their experiences not studied in more detail, and why do they not inform debates in more detail? And this, of course, has to do with the fact that, at least for decolonial theory, we don't have the same settler colonialism dynamics in Eurasia. We have much more imperial divide and rule practices and policies, which were similar features as settler colonialism, but also ones that were different and were not as disruptive and destructive. Then we have socialist modernity projects, which are again a bit different from the Western world, but they're not that much different as some would argue. And yeah, so this difference and this kind of nuance might be hard to grasp for people. But I would argue that these things have to be taken into account more in debates, and that is already happening. So, for example, we have a lot of research on the so-called non-aligned movement, where countries from various continents, from Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe, Eurasia, for example, Yugoslavia, Indonesia, and so on, who were basically uniting to practice mutual solidarity and help in order to be independent from both the Soviet bloc and the West, the US-led Western bloc. So this is a very interesting case, and yeah, I think it's important to be aware of this and make this also subject of our studies in order to be aware that there are certain alternatives, both from the Western and the former Western, former Eastern bloc, in terms of development and social organization. Another interesting perspective is provided by Kristen Gotzi, who in her book Second World, Second Sex is basically exploring different policies for gender equality and gender emancipation and cooperation between women's movements from the Eastern world, from the Eastern bloc, with women's movements from the global South. Again, very interesting and very eye-opening to see the progress that was actually made in terms of gender equality and emancipation in these usually underexplored parts of the world. And last but not least, I would like to mention the special issue that Réginas mentioned that we published 1.5 years ago. So that is on decolonial theory and practice in Southeast Europe. And there we try to think further this issue that we have a much different dynamic of domination and of imperialism in Eastern Europe and Eurasia. So maybe decolonial thought in its very original modality doesn't really apply to this region, but we can still learn from these debates and we can bring them into dialogue. So this dialoguing between post-colonial, decolonial theory and post-socialist theories is a very important thing that I'm happy to spend a few minutes discussing here, and I think we should have that on the radar in the future. So we have established this idea about the metaphorical versus this more substantive meaning of decoloniality, and can now move to the decolonial critique of state-building interventions. And yeah, as I already mentioned, I will try to focus more on the critique and the ways forward, and the definition of state-building interventions I can not provide in too much depth, so your follow-up questions are very welcome. And I would also point to next week's lecture by Yannick Keogh, who will go more in depth to the military aspect of interventions. So yeah, I hope that I can briefly navigate my way through this. Just a brief map. Where do these interventions take place? So we see there's a strong focus on various African countries, cases in Asia, but also, for example, and here the Second World comes in again, in former Yugoslavia, for example, in Kosovo or in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have different United Nations interventions. And as Réginas already mentioned, the idea of the state-building intervention is that you intervene in a country that is fragile, where institutions are basically destroyed, functional, and it needs to recover from large-scale conflicts such as civil wars or other types of conflict. And it's basically the idea of either building up institutions from scratch or at least helping them, capacitating them so that they can work again and the country can evolve peacefully. So one key kind of conceptual grounding through which state-building interventions have been done, according to a number of scholars, and that's very much an agreement across the field, is the so-called liberal peace. So the idea that countries can evolve peacefully if they adopt certain liberal and democratic institutional blueprints. So the idea being, in the first place, of course, you need some kind of peace, security, and rule of law. So that is very much linked to military intervention and military support to whatever regime is in the country. And yeah, here I would again point to next week's lecture. Then the next pillar being democratic elections and institutions, as well as human rights. So this idea that countries emerging from conflict or violent rule, they should establish a democratic rule in order for everyone to be represented, and because of a theory that basically only democratic countries can have long-lasting peace, whilst authoritarian or countries with other forms of rule, they are prone to conflict, whether it is interstate conflict or domestic conflict. And then a third crucial pillar of the liberal peace is free market economies and growth. So this idea, okay, developed Western countries, they have prosperity and wealth and long-lasting peace. So a country emerging from conflict also needs that. This is, as indicated, the theory, the kind of conceptual grounding of state-building interventions. And I think the long time that these interventions have been underway and have partly, basically been unsuccessful for decades, also shows that this theory is not really complete. However, turning to the more decolonial perspective on these things, we have to conclude that state-building interventions is, in the sense of this liberal peace and this intervention orthodoxy, basically conceived as a modernist endeavor. And in that sense, it's inextricably linked with modernity, capitalism, militarism, violence, and exploitation. In other words, if we go back to Quijano, who said that basically capitalism and the colonial nature of capitalist development is part of our world system, then we clearly see how basically state-building interventions, when they promote, for example, free market economics, they simply want to reproduce that system. They don't really want to give any freedom in how a country should design its economy. No, they want free markets. They also want access for Western companies to certain extractive industries, and in this way, state-building interventions reproduce often the reasons for conflict rather than mitigating them. And if we look, if we think back about this map across the world, and if we think about a long time that state-building interventions have been underway and unsuccessful, we can also conclude that basically the major geopolitical actors and also geopolitical structures such as United Nations or other regional organizations, even if they might say differently, they seem to have little or no interest in actually ending colonial and imperial domination. Rather, as I indicated, it can be argued that this domination and this ensuring of extractive interests and ensuring of an imbalance of power is part and parcel, basically, of these interventions and the kinds of institutions that they promote across the global south. So in this sense, it can be argued that what the UN and also leading countries in them promote as a liberal peace, de facto promotes an imperial peace. So a form of peace where imperial and colonial domination basically continues, whilst of course all the communication and the justification for the measures that are taken propagates a liberal intentionality. So stating intervention in the way that it is currently or has been recently done is in that sense to be rejected outright from a decolonial point of view, because as we established earlier, decolonial thought basically criticizes capitalism, it criticizes Eurocentrism, it criticizes the violence that is done by settler colonialism, and state-building interventions and its underlying interests in many ways simply reproduce these things. So it has to be rejected from a decolonial point of view. There's hope and there are some alternatives within this overarching agenda. And of course, state builders and people working in UN departments and so on would always say, no, everything is fine. We are basically decolonizing. I would disagree with that, but I agree that there are some hopes and also alternatives growing within the system. So some scholars have indicated there's a local turn kind of thing within the UN system and with international state building in general, where there's increasing attention to local and culturally, contextually specific forms of social ordering and to policy programming. And that is a good thing. And I will also go into this in the third part. However, this is also at the same time problematic because if the overall framework, if the overall approach doesn't change, then these little small changes and these attempts to kind of take on the view and the needs of people might also be mimicking change, but they might not really achieve it in the end. Then there's a very strong and also effective, to some extent, gender equality and emancipation agenda. For example, the Women, Peace and Security agenda with the UN resolution that was passed, I think 20 years ago by now. And this is, of course, an important aspect that in all these state institutions and in these practices that are being introduced, there is a degree of gender equality and equal access across genders. However, also there we can see a lot of tokenism. We can see cultural imposition in certain contexts of these agendas. And of course, there's patriarchal backlash with which then practitioners have to fight. So when societies want to resist certain gender equality ideas. Then a crucial point is potential outside the system. So if the system isn't working right, maybe there's a way of working outside of the system and achieving more sustainable peace there. And Walter Mignolo has introduced this idea under the term of delinking. So this idea that delinking from the system, you can maybe build more sustainable forms of order. And we have different examples for this. For example, Somaliland, one province in Somalia, then the Kurdish majority exclaves in Rojava and Afrin in Syria. In Latin America, a lot of examples, for example, Peru or Uruguay, I would argue, maybe others argue differently, or for example, also Rwanda, which has pursued a path of self-determination. However, and others might anyways know more about these cases, the general problem is that these hopeful cases are often wiped out by geopolitics. by great power politics, such as in Rojava and Afrin, for example, who have now been again basically occupied by the Syrian or by the Turkish army. And other critiques include claims that, okay, but these countries are authoritarian or they're populist, so it's not good. They're not democratic, so it cannot be good. This can be discussed in more detail, but I think that it more or less sums up the general tension. So these are the whole alternatives, and yeah, I want to pursue these further. In the last part, which I will try to keep a bit shorter in order to finish more or less on time, and I will briefly unmute my one monitor to remove this this menu bar. Hopefully, yeah, that should work. So I think you can see it again. I'm back, just to let you know. Right, I'm back. I hope that wasn't too tragic. I will just continue. Yeah, let me know if to take into account anything.
Problem, go ahead.
Yeah, my Chrome just crashed, but it reopened right away. So I will simply continue, and yeah. So I will take another 4 or 5 minutes, if that's okay, to finish this last part. And basically, I will pursue further these hopes and these potentials to maybe do a better way of state building within the existing system. But as I said, that is taken into account that actually a decolonial critique would reject state building mostly wholesale and would really say, okay, we need a completely different approach. And I think a first step towards finding a different approach to state building is working at the community level, because only there can we maybe find progressive and emancipatory practices, if they're at all possible. And once practices develop at that local level, maybe they could also inform higher scale processes. But that's all with the caveat that basically, as I said, in this world today, if there's a state, it is so much embedded in the international system and in the logics of capitalism that actually really decolonial state building is basically not possible. And so the first more applied example from actual research, once again, basically, emphasizes that, and is the example of Mechtel's research on bypass knowledge in Afghanistan. So Mechthild is a German colleague, so I'm translating all the text from her. So she did research with community-based women's organizations in Afghanistan, and she showed basically how they had visions for a different peace and a different way of building up society. And this vision was also clearly embedded in a commitment to women's rights and equality. And they basically rejected the military intervention in Afghanistan and also the state building efforts. So it was a wholesale rejection, because basically in Afghanistan, state building can only happen through military and various security practices. And so there we really see this problem that basically, in order to actually have potentially emancipatory and equalizing practices that are somehow compatible with a decolonial perspective, in certain intervention contexts, these are simply completely incompatible with state building intervention, because state building interventions, military intervention means still ongoing conflict. And in Afghanistan, the concrete question that basically provokes is what could and should replace this liberal peace intervention. And basically this understanding, okay, intervention that somehow at least corresponds to decolonial ideas is in that case simply not possible. Going further to Mira Sabaratnam's work on decolonizing intervention, so as this title already tells you, Mira believes in the possibility of decolonizing this intervention. Her research is on Mozambique, a post-civil war country, and basically she has made different methodological moves in order to also decolonize research, decolonize the way that we understand these societies. So this includes methodological and epistemological critique and rethinking by, for one, recovering the historical presence of Mozambican society, by engaging with political consciousness and really the way that people experience political ordering and political change, and by investigating material realities and the way that they are embedded in asymmetric relations of hierarchy. And so she makes various points, and I would, basically sum these up as one, somehow rethinking here, as in this fourth point, the peasant economy. So somehow ensuring a certain level of autonomy of peasants, but also ensuring their economic survival, which in this was basically, it meant that peasant food production basically needs to be somehow disconnected from international markets, because peasants are very vulnerable to international markets. And another point that she makes is that there should be solidaristic engagement and a post-colonial ethical order where there's a recognition of collective historical responsibility. So this idea that the order produced in Mozambique, but also the international order, there should be a way that actually historical guilt and wrongdoing is acknowledged, and that there is more solidarity, and that this wrongdoing is somehow mended. I think that's, the point in itself sense, but it is also, I think, arguably to an extent not possible, because we cannot simply see how such change should be occurring. And now to turn to a last point, to my own research, which we can also discuss in more detail. I'm mostly pursuing also this methodological route of trying to engage more with people and basically decolonize research, if that's anyhow possible. And in terms of conceptual argument, I try to argue that basically state building, it is post-liberal state building everywhere in the world, but especially in Kyrgyzstan, which is my prime research case. And the argument is basically that the liberalism that basically Western intervention actors are preaching and are selling to non-Western countries, it is already impossible, and such state building happens already in a post-liberal modality. There are other scholars such as David Chandler and Oliver Richmond who have provided more detail, and I try to develop this argument in the Central Asian context. In terms of the kind of research and methodology moves that I'm trying to make, one of them is a cooperative approach to research, where basically we try to avoid risks and manage and avoid risks to the safety of both participants, but also of researchers, and where there's a more dialogic approach to production, meaning we exchange preliminary drafts and people basically know what I write about them, which also means translating into local language, such as Russian translations, because Russian is a primary language in Kyrgyzstan. And I've developed this further in an article also in Central Asian Survey, this approach of cooperative knowledge production. Then that means, in a concrete sense, accompanying civil society organizations and also communities. So I have, for example, accompanied one civil society platform who have done both national level policy making advocacy, but who also work in communities to make basically the population and local actors cooperate better with law enforcement, meaning with police, as is illustrated here in this one picture. And I also work with UNFPA, the UN Population Fund, basically on trying to develop lessons from existing projects. So here was one project on engaging women religious leaders in prevention of violent extremism, and I help kind of distilling some lessons and providing improvement for future work in this organization. And then a more long-term and bigger agenda is to basically reveal the entanglements in the matrix of power. That is the case both in Kyrgyzstan, but also more across the post-socialist world. So there are clear links where we can see basically that through, let's say, racism, through different societal structuring, the coloniality of power is operating both in Kyrgyzstan, but also in other contexts. So, for example, I'm doing research on local communities outside of Bishkek, slums basically, that are cut off from utility networks and from political representation, and where then international projects are run in order to give this idea, well, there's a way forward and we can also include these communities. And I'm comparing these initiatives with Roma minority neighborhoods and Turkish origin minority neighborhoods in Bulgaria, where there's basically a big kind of cutoff and a big negligence on part of state institutions, as indicated by this photo here. So we see such processes of exclusion and othering basically across the post-socialist world and more globally. And I'm trying to explore that further, and I'm happy to answer further questions about this. For now, thank you for the attention. Sorry for briefly dropping out, and sorry for going over a bit, and I really look forward to all of your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Philip, for this good presentation. And now it's my pleasure to invite Abiosseh to react on Philip's keynote speech. Abiosseh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Réginas. So I'm not going to present a PowerPoint because I only have one monitor, so I think it'll be too complicated. But I'm not here to contradict anything that Philipp has presented. I think that we are very much aligned in terms of this thinking, where I want to complement what Philipp has presented is in providing the kind of practitioner perspective and what this looks like on the ground. What does it look like to work in this colonial system on the ground, and also what I feel can be done to change or transform this colonial system. Although I think Philipp and I are both in agreement that what really needs to take place is a complete dismantling. But as a previous panel discussed, what are the costs of completely dismantling the system, and who is going to bear that cost? And so in thinking about that, and in thinking about the potential impacts that this would have on human rights defenders or others who are really within the system, then there needs to be some thought about ways of transforming that system, but in a way that's really meaningful. So I just want to start with some quotes, and just a warning, they might shock you. But these are quotes that I or friends have heard working in this sector. Maybe we should bring colonialism back. You know, the countries that can take care of themselves, and those that can't, we'll just manage them. Unfortunately, smaller, locally headquartered organizations just don't have the capacity to resource mobilize. We want to hire someone with local knowledge, but also have technical skills. It's really impossible to find. We need to substantiate this local analysis with other sources. One cannot trust the transparency of local organizations to manage such an amount of money in a poor country. We don't work for partners, they work for us. These are the kinds of comments that you can hear every day working in this industry. And so when we talk about the effects of colonialism and how the international development industry, and I call it an industry on purpose because it is an industry, how this system is actually designed to perpetuate colonialism. Hearing these kinds of comments makes it more evident just how steeped in colonialism the sector and our work is. So I might repeat a little bit of what Philipp has said, but I want to give it a very local or a very kind of practical dimension. And what I want to talk about is how or why we need to decolonize state building and peace building. The first reason is that state building and peace building interventions are centered on Western models of state development. And by centering on Western models of state development, they don't allow for organic development of nations in the way that Europe was able to develop their nation in North America to a certain extent. And rather, they impose ideologies that are based on experiences from these colonial places. And I'll just give a couple of examples here. So for example, election assistance is based on the assumption that elections establish legitimacy for leaders at all levels of government. But if we actually look at what's happening in the context at the moment, in the global context, all you have to do is take the US elections, and you can see how easily the legitimacy of elections as the foundation for a functioning government can be questioned. And so why are we pushing one type of assistance or one type of model of governance, a model that's barely working in the places it was quote unquote developed, and we're pushing it in other places without any thought as to whether it's relevant, whether it's bringing about positive outcomes for the population, whether it's the most appropriate way of governance or legitimizing governance in those contexts. And then the worst thing about all of this is that these experiments keep failing, and then their failures are not just an exercise in proving or disproving hypotheses about the best way of forming legitimate governance. They actually have real life consequences for people in these quote unquote intervention areas. And those consequences potentially do way more harm than they do good, because they come in, they disrupt functioning forms of governance, they establish competing forms of governance, and they create conditions where the state is actually exacerbating the existing divides rather than serving as a unifying force. I think Réginas would be able to attest to that, as we both work together on peace building interventions in Burundi. And on the peace building side, we see that there's this Western-centered understanding of like what peace is and how peace should be built. And so this is reflected in the types of interventions that are funded. And you see a lot of funding for peacemaking interventions that are really militarized solutions, and not as much funding for local social cohesion building interventions. And this is really based also on the model of how Europe and America have developed their peace and how they keep their peace, which is through this really militarized kind of social order, where there might be other ways of keeping social order that don't necessarily rely on the military, and also don't necessarily focus on government officials, and don't exclude other parts of the population in these processes. And by other parts, I really mean women, youth, ethnic minorities, people living with disabilities. And by the time you add all of those people up, that's the majority of the population. So the fact that these state building and peace building processes are based on these Western models, they limit the creativity that we have in terms of how to build functioning states, they limit flexibility, they limit adaptability to the context. And then they do a disservice both to those who are funding interventions, because these interventions are proving themselves to be less and less effective. And so we're wasting a lot of money, but also they are a disservice to the people who are on the receiving end, because they're actually not able to shape their own trajectory by themselves. They are forced to follow a trajectory that's being imposed on them. The second reason why state building and peace building interventions need to be decolonized is because they replicate colonial systems of centralized power and knowledge, and they create these dichotomies of what's considered ideal and what's considered deficient. And all you have to do is look at the sector itself to see evidence of this. First, you look at the staffing structure of donor organizations, multilateral institutions, and INGOs. So maybe for donors, you can say, well, they need to employ their citizens, so that's why they would pick someone who's a citizen from that country. But for INGOs, if you browse through the web pages of the most prominent INGOs or even small ones, the leadership is predominantly white and male. And same for UN agencies. And if you do see a few people of color, I mean, it's quite small. And if that picture looks grim, then you just look at the senior leadership of the organization. So among 10 of 15 people who might be considered senior leaders, you have 1 or 2 who are not white, European, or North American. And so how do we pretend that this system is not colonial or neo-colonial when even the optics speak for themselves? But beyond the optics, the real challenge is what this means about who gets to make decisions on basis and understanding they get to make those decisions, and whether those decisions are actually the most relevant decisions for the people on the ground. And then there's how knowledge and expertise is understood and valued. All too often, you meet people who, by virtue of being from a higher income country, believe that they know what's best for a country. You observe them in meetings, they're literally and figuratively taking all of the space and rendering people from those contexts second-class citizens in the discourse about their own countries. Sometimes they don't even get to sit at the main table or in the front of the discussion. And then if you watch BBC, what do you notice? Have you noticed that there's all of these experts on Somalia, Libya, DRC, but they're all American, Canadian, Belgian, British, and these experts present themselves as though, they know everything without even acknowledging that it's problematic for them to be speaking on behalf of these populations, that they don't have these kind of inextricable ties, that they can study this as a point of interest. It's not a lived reality. And what's the criteria for selecting these so-called experts? The number of books they've written, maybe the number of articles they've written, if they've given talks, did they work in the country for 3 months, have they written a policy that's affected that country? And you wonder, does writing a policy render you more knowledgeable and legitimate to speak about a country than the people from that country itself? And then so these kinds of exchanges kind of replicate this paternalistic colonial relationship that assume that quote unquote white saviors know what's best for non-whites, and so that's why they should be invited to speak as experts in these spaces. But it also closes the space for realistic and relevant strategy development, because the people with the most knowledge are actually not at the table designing and implementing these processes. And further, if you look at the practice of partnerships in either donors or INGOs, then you can absolutely see the colonial relationship. I mean, the fact that the funding itself comes from former colonial powers, or even powers such as Sweden, who don't want to recognize their former colonial history. The money is channeled through organizations from their own country, and then there's limited requirement to meaningfully and I don't mean in a tokenistic way, but in a meaningful way, partner with local actors and draw from local expertise. And then not only is the structure of these relationships problematic, but what's worse is the way in which INGO and donors behave towards local partners. They shift the risks and responsibilities, and then they don't shift any of the power. And the inequalities in these relationships in shaping interventions and implementing them and evaluating them visibly manifest a perpetuation of colonial dynamics that are extractive while pretending to be saving. So how can state building and peace building be decolonized without special attention to these unequal and paternalistic relationships? And then my last point is that state building and peace building interventions have always been underpinned by the desire of the West to see states that are dependent on them and also that are in the service of them. So if you look at the current arguments for peace building now in Europe or state building, it's we should fund these interventions so we can stop migrants from coming. Well, then you dig a little bit deeper, and not only are these migratory patterns influenced by colonial systems in the first place, but it's the current Western interventions that are driving these migratory patterns. It's not a Malian company that's extracting uranium in northern Mali, and it's not a Syrian company that's extracting resources from Syria. Like at this juncture, you have a lot of Western countries, and we see this a lot in the DRC. So there's all this talk about stabilizing the DRC while all of the mining companies are from Switzerland, Canada. And so let's not pretend that this aid is just for some sort of altruistic measure. It's also a way of accessing the resources that the West wants. And it's also, and the narrative around that, and this narrative around stopping migration, what's problematic about it is that it actually loses sight of the primary purpose of these interventions in the first place. So we start talking about preventing migration and not talk about improving the conditions for people in these countries. And that's how we've ended up with these kind of decades of neoliberal development approaches that have rendered countries more fragile, not less. And there's been no accountability for the institutions and the people who've pushed these policies and that have expanded the gaps between rich and poor, that have created these conflictual dynamics, that have eliminated social safety nets, and that have created this kind of reinforcing loop where you now need more interventions to deal with the decimated safety nets that were created by the previous interventions. And so what are the mechanisms that we have in terms of accountability to make it harder for people to treat developing countries? And then for me, my primary interest being Africa, how do we stop them from treating us like a petri dish where you come to prove or disprove your theory and then there's no consequences for those who are taking the action, but only those who are supposed to be the recipients of all of this goodwill? So having said all that, under these circumstances, what do I think should be done in terms of addressing the system of colonialism that underpins the state building and peace building interventions? Well, one, intervention should be based on a systemic analysis. Oftentimes people do a very limited analysis, and that limited analysis serves in their interest because it doesn't link the past and the present, and it doesn't address the fact that previous as well as continuing legacies of structural and behavioral colonialism are actually feeding into the dynamics of the problems that are created. So actually doing a systemic analysis would shift the way in which interventions are planned, and the imagination of these interventions to go beyond a kind of reduction and securitized approach. Second is applying a perspective that looks at assets and not only needs. And I think here I'm repeating what Professor Bemba said during the first debate, which is that if we look around the world, we are not taught, yes, there's a lot of fragility, but we're also talking about contexts where there are a lot of assets. And it's a real disservice to pretend that there are not any assets in these quote unquote intervention countries. And that, of course, is in the interest of the interventionists, because if you pretend that there's no assets, then you bring your own model and then you impose your model. But if you recognize that they're assets, then that requires you to take those assets into consideration and not to completely destroy existing systems, but to leverage existing systems in ways that you can create more effective interventions. Third, recenter state building and peace building in the purpose of supporting communities, countries, societies to improve the lives of people. I recognize that the global system of financing makes it difficult as development agencies. They have to give justifications why they need money for these kinds of interventions. But in vilifying non-European populations and establishing justifications for neocolonial interventions that aim to conquer and subjugate Black and brown bodies and prevent them from reaching Europe and America, it reinforces these colonial ideologies, and it reinforces this sense of fear of the other, and it loses sight of the whole purpose of the work, which is to improve the lives of those in the intervention countries. So recentering has a high potential for us to recognize and explore alternative forms of state building. Then fourth, I have reflection and acceptance of the inherent and central role of racism and colonialism in current development interventions. Many of the people on the line are studying, and so you are constantly maybe engaging in this discourse. But in the practitioner world, people come from different sectors, or they've even forgotten that this discourse is happening. And so they are replicating these kind of colonial relationships without internalizing what that means, and without recognizing that these are colonial relationships. And as recently as in the wake of the elections in the US, recently there's been a saying that actually it's not up to Black people to convince white people to be better. That's the job of other white people. And similarly for the state building and peace building sector, it's not the responsibility of intervention countries to push the envelope to insist on decolonizing development and state building and peace building. And while they're doing so, actually it's up to the sector to save itself. And the sector can only save itself by actually being upfront about the history, upfront about what's been driving the current state of the sector, and really make a strong commitment to decolonizing. I'm Gambian American, and one thing that struck me is I work with a lot of Europeans, and I've been struck by how many people are appalled and how many critiques I hear about Trump, and how many people are really so surprised at what's happening in the US and so bothered by it. But at the same time, the same people who launch all of these complaints are very complicit in the system of colonialism that exists in state building and peace building. They're not critiquing that system, and they're not critiquing the white supremacist ideology on which this system is based. The fifth thing is to recognize the dynamism of context and to value exposure and exchange over imposition. For me, being from and working in Africa, one thing that always struck me is that the continent is always described in a way that's very static. And so there's questions like, you know, if we don't do this, will we have more dictators? Will there be a push for human rights? Well, Africa is part of the global system. We're not apart from the system. We are central in the system. And so the assumption that we can't change without this imposition of other perspectives and other narratives, to me, is doing us a disservice. So we're not a continent where people just bring best practices. It's also a continent where we develop best practices. And recognizing that means that bringing in new ideas, our ideas are just that, they're ideas, and it's up to the countries, it's up to those cities to adopt them or not. And you gain more from exposure and exchange of ideas than you can gain from imposing. Sixth is prioritizing local leadership and not just local ownership. Local ownership, local turn, localization, these are all terms that have been thrown around for decades, and they're essentially pursuing the same thing. How do you kind of decentralize power and give more power to local actors? But if you look at the progress that's been made, it's so limited, and not even in the basic ways of direct funding to local actors has there been much pressure. And progress has been even slower in terms of creating conditions for the transfer of power and the design, implementation, and evaluation of interventions. A decolonial approach would not only be about the transfer of funds, but also the transfer of powers. And it's not simply about hiring Black and Brown people. It's about recognizing their legitimacy and making decisions that are necessary, not only for their countries, but for the sector at large. 7 is moving away from decolonizing towards reimagining. In my opinion, one of the most violent repercussions of colonialism, slavery, and racism is that it centers all non-white identities around their interaction with Europe, with Europeans who migrated across the world. And it means that our past and our present and our future possibilities are all centered around whiteness. Now, we can't change the past, and the present is, of course, here with us. But I think the future can be reimagined. And so even moving away from simply thinking about decolonizing and actually thinking about creating a new future, a different future, a future that doesn't center on this experience, that recognizes the experience of colonialism, but doesn't center reality around that, can be a huge opening for new perspectives and new ideas, and maybe opportunities that are more effective than the way we've been going about state building and peace building. And finally, bridging the divide between academia and practitioners. Today, we're here in a space where we're openly debating decolonization. We're informed by rich academic literature. But unfortunately, in the practitioner space, people don't have time to read 1,500 pages worth of academic literature as they navigate their way through practice. And the discourse that's happening here is very interesting and very progressive, but it doesn't translate because sometimes it seems that academia is speaking to itself. You have scholars that speak to each other through their writing, and none of this is in a way that's accessible either for practitioners or for people or just for anyone on the ground. And so if in academia is where we're seeing this really strong call for decolonizing research, as Philipp is doing, then another thought that needs to happen in academia is how it can engage practitioners in a way that can really facilitate the transformation that's needed. So how do you as students, how do professors, and how do others in the academic space help practitioners to engage in this discourse in a way that brings about personal, sectoral, and systemic change. So that's my small contribution to the discourse or the dialogue that we're having today, and looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abiosseh. Thank you very much, Philipp, for those insightful thoughts. I think what you said is very interesting and complementary, because Philipp touches the issue from an academic perspective, and Abiosseh from a practitioner perspective, and it's very interesting. But my question to Philipp is to challenge the power structure which sustain colonial ways of thinking and doing. What can be the role of knowledge production? Because it's something that Abiosseh tried to touch upon, and I think it's something that you can address also. What the role of knowledge production industry in challenging these unequal power relations?
Yeah, so I will answer directly to this, and maybe also briefly, because it's very clear. Abiosseh just mentioned it in her last point. The role probably shouldn't be to write thousands of pages, peer-reviewed articles and books that then are not accessible, not even to students, and let alone practitioners, because they don't have the time to read these things. I mean, take into account that we're not talking only about practitioners, but maybe also about wider populations, right? So how peace building, state building interventions work is also a concern for the targeted societies, but also societies maybe, let's say, across the world, even societies of these dominant global actors, right? Because they can also change and transform interventions. So the role should be for academia to be an archive, to be really this kind of notepad where these things are documented in a clear and understandable way. And it can also basically facilitate and advance these struggles and these processes, in my opinion. That's a very activist perspective for academics, but I think it's worth pursuing, and this contribution is needed in order to further advance not only the theoretical rethinking, but also practical attempts to say, okay, can we change foreign policy? Can we change state building and peace building, practical approaches, and so on? So be the notepad, be the archive for this overall process.
You're on mute, Réginas.
You're still muted.
sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Philipp. For participants, you can always ask your questions through the link, Pull Everywhere. It's in the chat. So you can always ask your questions and be involved also in prioritizing which question you think is more relevant to be addressed in this debate. So the link is in the chat. And I also have a question for Abiosseh. I was wondering where the decolonial perspective can meet the gender perspective, and to what extent it can be relevant for the work you do on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, as I mentioned, I think that we cannot look at countries outside of the West as places that do not change or places that are static. They're dynamic. And I think that the kind of global movements towards gender equality actually mean that whether or not we are pushing a gender agenda, there will be one. And I think the research on Afghanistan shows that women peace builders, women CSOs have their own ideas about building peace. And that's not because they interacted with the West, that's because they lived in a reality. And so I think that the question is how far and how quickly all countries would get there. But at the same time, we've been pushing the agenda and it's still going quite slow. So I really think it's time to pass the baton to women themselves to really take the leadership in pushing for gender equality. And I have personally no doubts that this movement will continue with or without some extensive funding from Western countries.
Thank you. And I have another question also, but because I think Philipp mentioned something very essential when he said, okay, we need to use the matrix of power as an analytical tool. And we would say that state building interventions represent a space where those who have power and the powerless encounter. And do you think actually it's that state building is a decolonizable space? Does it really have a potential to be decolonized? And what's found your optimism or pessimism? I don't know. It's for both of you.
Should I go first, Abiosseh? Yeah, so I mean, it's good that Abiosseh actually at the beginning of her comments that you mentioned that, of course, state building is right now done through this Western template and is based on this Western historical experience and this idea that if we build a state elsewhere, it definitely needs to look like a Western state. It needs to work the same way and so on. So if it was ever possible to decolonize it, maybe it would be more through a more mixed or non-Western based model, like the state as people in a given place would say it has to look. But I think the more important point is that, I mean, if we think about states, so states are basically constructions that somehow are supposed to govern a few million people, or let's say just a few thousands, right? And if you do that, according to certain, let's say, social theorists, there will always be some conflict, there will always be some trouble, especially when you put, I don't know, resources and, I don't know, certain cultural or other, identities in the mix. So to an extent, I think we have to be pessimistic and understand that such high-scale social organization is always hard to organize. But if we wanted to try to make it better, it would definitely have to be without imposing models, but by letting them emerge on their own and by having this kind of more endogenous approach, if that's anyhow possible.
And I think for me, I mean, on the pessimistic side, I really don't see the kind of militarized peace building and state building processes actually being able to be decolonized. But as Philipp said, looking at alternative models, and for me, really recentering state building on what's the actual purpose, which is not necessarily creating quote unquote technically functional states, but really creating states that are in service of their people. That is an opportunity for decolonizing state building. And I didn't answer the first question, but it relates to the first question for me, is that one of the roles that academia can play is really in documenting alternative ways of social order. I remember when I was studying in Senegal was the first time that I realized that even in my own region, there were differences in the way different groups were socially ordered, and not just in which caste system that they adopted, etc., but there were really groups that had democratic process.
She's frozen, right? Or disconnected?
Yeah, she's disconnected.
We'll hopefully come back very soon.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, maybe we can go on another question before she comes back. I think the two defining features of colonial enterprises were accumulation and dispossession. And I was wondering why these two terms or features apply to state building interventions as well. To what extent do they relate to dispossession and accumulation? Philipp.
Yeah, thank you, Réginas. It's good to get the opportunity to elaborate on this, because earlier I mentioned how, well, basically these state building interventions, they don't challenge the way things go, but they simply reproduce it, right? And I'll again pick up on one of Abiosseh's examples about the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is just one example for many other cases, where we basically see, so state building intervention intervenes, let's say, in the political sphere, saying you need to have democratic elections. It intervenes into, I don't know, rule of law and so on. But when it comes to basically these conflicts over extractive rights and over the, basically the profiteering of Western companies, usually the intervention is very quiet or doesn't say anything at all. So if such intervention inspired by these liberal and democratic and also transparent and accountable principles is done, then it also needs to extend into the extractive sector, basically. This sometimes means getting involved in still ongoing conflict, because there's a lot of warlord groups and different smaller groups around these conflicts, but it still means it. And maybe on a higher level, it also means that if we want to improve the system, we have to basically hold this Western hypocrisy to account and say you cannot just do state building, but you let the whole extractive business go on as usual. You also then have to basically impose sanctions and maybe even take away the licenses from Western companies that profiteer from raw materials that are mined in conflict-affected areas.
Abiosseh, are you back?
I am.
Okay, thank you. Welcome back. So can you your argument?
Sure. So essentially what I was saying is that there are different models of governance that have existed over time, and the kind of Western domination of documentation has meant that these models have gotten less exposure than the Western models. And so I think academia really has a role to play there in terms of documenting, in terms of telling histories, in terms of amplifying different ways of understanding the world than the one that is the dominant way of understanding the world. And I also think that the academic space really needs some internal reflection on how to valorize other ways of thinking, so that it's not just about having more non-Western scholars, but also having scholars that think differently, that use different sources, that base their arguments on different sources, and that those sources are also looked at as valid sources and valid analysis, and that the analysis that is valorized is not the analysis that just regurgitates what we all have learned in university for the past 300 years or so about how the way the world works.
While you were offline, we discussed another maybe interesting issue. We said, two defining features of colonial enterprises are like accumulation and dispossession, and you touched upon the issue of accumulation. And I was wondering if you see how also state building interventions relate to dispossession to some extent.
I mean, as I mentioned, I think that actually state building interventions were designed to dispossess people in non-Western countries. The whole point of constructing states was to facilitate Europe's ability to interact with entities on these continents, and they were not natural states that were formed. And the ways in which the states were formed also seem to be designed to sow some sort of discord, to make it easier to to instrumentalize the kind of conflicts that exist in states in order to be able to easier access resources. All you have to do is look at the DRC, and that's a very clear example of how the state was constructed in a way to facilitate resource extraction. And it continues to be run in that manner. So for me, the modernist liberal state interventions are really all about facilitating access and extraction and dispossessing. And that's why I think both Philipp and I said that, like, really what's required is not a transformation of the system, but like a complete dismantling of it, because the foundation on which it's built is rotten.
If I can add to
yes, yeah. Sure.
Yeah, and another example would maybe be Iraq as well, because actually the term state building, at least in this newer academic literature, it evolved over intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there we can probably clearly see the extractive interest also of very certain geopolitical actors. But I also would add that at the same time, of course, these actors try to hide or simply deny that they have these interests, right? So, and Abiosseh, when you were just briefly out, I said that basically in this slide, state building interventions would basically have to mention extractive firms or simply not give them access to licenses. And yeah, I mean, maybe at least the fact that this interest is being denied and that they proclaim accountability and transparency and justice might also be something that you can take to hold them to account to change state building practice. But whether that is so, yeah, it's difficult. And the big question is also who should do that, right? So can it be done just by a couple of NGOs or by a couple of politicians from a couple of countries? There's a big problem of organization here. Organization of political struggles, by whom and in what forum? Should it be the United Nations or elsewhere? So things are happening, but somehow everything is too atomized and not effective enough, as we currently see.
Yeah.
And I think it becomes...
Yeah, go on.
I think it's also complicated by like the implication and complicity of elite actors and maybe non-elite actors in the countries that we're talking about and the role they play. And so for me, one of the clear areas where there is a lot of hypocrisy is in the discourse around corruption, because I think, one, if you look at the current state of the US government, its propensity towards nepotism has been really exposed as of late, but also in the way in which the trade actors, because you have your development wing and then you have your trade wing, and they're working in coordination but for very different interests. And so at the same time that state building interventions are insisting on, transparency and accountability, you have trade officials making these agreements that are clearly to the detriment of the population and do not respect any kind of international laws or agreements, and are facilitating, a horrendous extraction of materials. And so I think that hypocrisy there for me demonstrates how challenging it will be to kind of change the system, because as you say, who will do it? It can't be a couple of NGOs. And how will this system actually change in a meaningful way? And especially now, I think as well with the introduction of new actors like Russia or China or Turkey, who are more engaged globally and are pursuing the same kind of intervention approaches as the West. And so what do we do in this circumstance? How do we kind of reset the balance and how do we empower local actors, but recognizing the kind of corruption that's been encouraged in order to facilitate access of countries to resources.
Now let's read the pull everywhere questions. So I think the question which was voted by many participants is, what about the Western obsession with democracy as a panacea for all kinds of development / peace-building issues? Although democracy is often seen as objectively the best system, isn't this also based on Western values? Shouldn't we, as Abiosseh mentioned, focus more on other actors than the state? What are your thoughts about this?
So I would give it a start, yeah?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I think we already discussed that when you posed that question about how could state building intervention be decolonized, if at all, and I said, well, if at all, it would have to be other systems, other approaches towards organizing a society than Western ones. I mean, it probably depends a bit to what extent you see democracy as a Western concept, because people could argue, well, okay, the West maybe lays claims on democracy as being its own concept and it being the great inventor of that. But there might be other people that say, well, it's a pluriversal concept, right? There are different kind of philosophy and understandings of society through which basically democracy can be both theorized and also practiced. So in this sense, yes, this Western obsession is bad. It's also wrong with this world of democracy, and we should accept that there are different approaches to democracy, and that there shouldn't be a monopoly by the West on this term. And other actors than the state, as I said, they're absolutely crucial. Without them, it cannot happen. And I would even almost say, let's not think so much about the state for the time being. Let's think about how to organize communities and whether we can somehow build an actual state, like a large-scale social organization. That's already a much more difficult question, which, yeah, for the time being, I would postpone if I could. But of course, it's the lecture topic, so I would just say it's very difficult.
I pretty much agree with what Philipp is saying. I think, the West is just pretending to own democracy. There are other ways in which people have practiced democratic governance, and those ways are not recognized. And perhaps those ways are not recognized because elections, democracy are also a moneymaker. And so I can recall some jokes around the Gambian elections because we use marbles instead of using these computerized systems of voting. And so, I mean, I think the obsession with critiquing that or making fun of that is also about how do you create an economy around so-called democratic elections. But I really think that we should maybe even move away from just talking about one type of governance and really talking about what is a governance system, or what is governance that's in service of people and in service of the people who are choosing to be part of that governance system. And in that sense, I think, as Philipp said, it would be really difficult because I think in the current context, it's hard to get people away from this obsession. But I also think the obsession is due to the amount of money that can generate and circulate.
Thank you. Another question from Paul everywhere. It's made this as the next question. Okay, yeah. International NGOs have a lot of power and resources, and they could initiate change by giving local people a high position, for example, that they can take over. Is this happening, and does it work? Or do you think that total dismantling is the only way to this decolonial transition?
So I can take this. One,
Yeah.
I think that the power and resources of international NGOs is overstated. Personally, working in one, I can say that donors have a lot of influence, and INGOs sometimes are at the whim of donors. And so even when we are pushing for something or we do know what should be done, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to get done, because we are at the whim of those who finance us. In my opinion, as I've observed the change of structure, I mean, I mentioned that if you look at all of the organizations or major NGOs, you will not really find women, and definitely not women of color, and also barely men of color at the top of these organizations or in the senior leadership. I have seen a drive for getting more people from context into this kind of middle management process, in this middle management, but at the same time, I haven't seen the transfer of power. I've just seen I've just seen the hiring of staff that have Black and brown faces, or faces from the areas, if you're talking about somewhere like Kyrgyzstan, but not necessarily being given all the power that they need to really be able to transform the system. And I really personally don't think that unless you change the composition of the highest level, you're going to be able to make changes that are really profound throughout the system. And I don't necessarily see a real commitment to changing, to making the change at the top level. Yeah, I mean, I perused a lot of websites recently, and anything from the senior leadership to the board composition is just terribly depressing.
Yeah, maybe
you want to add something? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, affirming all you said, Abiosseh, and I would even add that, I mean, even when you have these people in the higher positions, you will probably have to change the mission statement, the constitution, the goals, like the whole software, right? Because, I mean, there are many examples of, yeah, let's say you have people in the right position, but how did they get there? I mean, the best recent example is, for example, Kamala Harris. Like, yes, she's a woman of color, now elected vice president, but she's also known as a law and order candidate, right? And to have a quite punitive and partly exclusionary policy agenda. So that's just one example, and there are others of, you know, for example, women world leaders making it to the top, but actually their approach, like best example, Angela Merkel. I mean, that's a quite male, at least the policies that she pushed through are very male, and she's just, you know, doing what the white male majority in her party was telling her. I don't know if Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand would be a better example in terms of also changing the culture, maybe, but it's still quite hard. So that's the problem, that individual stories of change, for them to really transform into organizational and cultural change, that's still such a long way. It might be a start, but yeah, in the meantime, we have to pursue other probably pathways of change as well, because we can't just rely on that.
Yeah. Another question from everywhere. It reads as follows: even within the current dominant Western views on society, there should be things that we can share with other countries in order that they don't make the same mistakes we have made in the past. Any thoughts?
I mean, I think sharing is always a good thing. The issue is not sharing, the issue is imposing. And as I said, you know, the world is dynamic. There are things that people borrow from other countries all the time. If we take the COVID crisis, I think Africa, for example, borrowed heavily from the Chinese model, and not very much from the European or American models, thank God. So you know, there's always this kind of sharing and exchange and adoption of best practices that happens organically. The problem is not the sharing. The problem is when one idea or one method or one approach is actually the one that's imposed. And that's where, you know, we get things like structural adjustment. Like, not every country needs to have their economy structured in the same way as the US, that with like everything from education to health privatized. And so, you know, yeah, the problem is not sharing, it's really imposing.
Yeah, to add, and maybe also to clarify, but maybe the two of you understood it, because it says we can still share with other countries these things so they don't make the same mistakes. So I'm assuming that this is more Western countries, Netherlands, I don't know. So, I mean, of course, we should tell other countries what mistakes, and I mean, we in a sense of, okay, maybe Germany, Western Europe. Yes, these countries should tell other countries not to make the same mistakes, definitely, but currently they are not. Currently what's happening is still, well, do it exactly as us and you can become as great as us. Which is, of course, a complete hoax. So, but I think, let's say, if we go away from international state building intervention and we go to this more international solidarity between non-state actors, between, you know, among academics, NGOs, and so on, there's definitely a lot that we can share, right? And bad practices that we can tell each other to avoid and try to construct better solutions.
Yeah. Okay, another question. Do you think that strengthening civil society in countries where people cannot really afford to protest, etc., for a long time can help instigate the decolonization process of state building from below? Mm-hmm. Any thought?
I mean, I think we also need to maybe decolonize what we think civil society is. It's not necessarily always organizations. I mean, the revolution in Sudan was led by youth that were kind of loosely organized. So it doesn't necessarily mean strengthening organizations per se. I think giving people the tools, or introducing people to tools that they can adapt and adopt as they see fit to really call for the type of governance that they want is a decolonial approach. But I think that the importance is letting people really shape their trajectory and giving them the power to shape that trajectory rather than creating the trajectory for them.
Yeah, I mostly agree. I mean, of course, there should be some supporting capacity building in order to have some bottom-up kind of influence. Yeah, and still keeping in mind basically this issue that I mean, only because you make change, only because you have progress to the better, doesn't mean that you necessarily decolonize. There might still be a lot of colonial features, but it might be a start to a process. So in that sense, yes, definitely that should.
Okay, thank you. Maybe the last question. It's my impression. I always have the impression that the international public opinion seems to reject the logic underlying the colonial structures and mindset. But my question is, what keeps the colonial ways of doing things taking place? That's my last question.
Why do people vote for the alt-right? I mean, you know, it's interest and it's and I mean, I think the foundations are rooted in like white supremacist ideology, and letting that go is very challenging for people because they don't know what their place in society will be without that.
Yeah. Also, I think, I mean, one thing is really this coloniality of knowledge, maybe let's call it. So the fact that this coloniality, which is still there, as we hopefully show today, it's often constructed as something different. It's constructed as modernity, which at first sight is great because it means having good things, maybe being rich, whatever. So coloniality, of course, presents itself as something completely different. So that basically once we live modernity, we forget maybe the colonial underside of it. So this kind of completely wrong representation of coloniality as modernity is probably what keeps it alive most. But then, of course, also all these other continuing, basically, tropes of difference and of hatred. And yeah, just to also pick up another question that was submitted, if I consider Russia as a former colonial power in Central Asia, I would say yes, but of course there's a controversy whether it can be called colonial, and you say, well, let's call it imperial power because Russia in Central Asia is not the same as the UK, as England in Africa, and so on and so on. So that's technically true, but actually the things that it did in that region are reasonably similar to the other colonial situations, to still call it like that. So for, let's say, reflective or critiquing purposes, we shall use that term to really, kind of exhibit the colonial nature of this domination. And we need to continue doing so, because otherwise, to return to Réginas's question, these things will stay in place. So we need to continue that work of exhibiting.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure to have you all in this debating development series. So before we end, I have two announcements to make. Next Tuesday, we'll have our final formal webinar at the same time, same platform with the same rules of the game. The topic will be decolonization and military interventions. We will have two speakers, Yannick Keo, he is the Executive Director of the Information and Research Group for Peace, and Jacques Desbiens, who works at the International School of Security Forces in Cameroon. The second announcement concerns the closing events. Our closing event, the role of the diaspora in memory of the colonial past, will take place on the 1st of December. This was supposed to be a physical gathering, but because of the COVID measures, it will now be live streamed. This event will start at 4 o'clock and not at 7 o'clock, the usual starting time of our webinars. We will have also very interesting speakers like Nadia Saï. She will talk about the colonial legacies in Belgium. And the event contains also some performances by hip-hop artist Passy and by slam poet Sekou Wologom. So this event will be in Dutch. That's also very important. Yeah, and that's all. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot again for the invitation. It was a great pleasure, and for raising questions and further discussing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for bringing us on this platform and giving us the space to exchange on this really interesting topic. And I'm looking forward to listening to the audio of the next series.
Sure.
Let's see if they vow to join this agenda.
Yes, militaries for decolonization.
Or if they have some alternative propositions for All right, enjoy the evening. Pretty tired after this day, but
yeah, I can imagine.
Really refreshing and inspiring. All the best. Bye-bye.
So you really did well to come, and I think we will have